The community center smelled like old coffee and floor polish. It was the kind of place where bake sales happened on Tuesdays and yoga classes met on Thursday mornings. Nothing fancy, just a large room with folding chairs, a small stage, and terrible lighting that made everyone look a little yellow. But tonight was different. Tonight was the annual talent showcase, and nearly 200 people had packed themselves into those uncomfortable chairs. Kids squirmed in their seats. Parents held up phones ready to record their little stars. The air buzzed with that particular kind of excitement that comes right before someone gets up on stage. In the very back row, pressed against the wall like she was trying to disappear into it, sat Margaret Chen. She was 67 years old. With silver hair she'd pulled back into a neat bun. Her hands wouldn't stop shaking. She'd folded them in her lap, then unfolded them, then folded them again. Nothing helped. Margaret had lived in this town for 40 years. She'd been the head librarian at the public library for most of that time. Everyone knew her as the nice lady who always had good book recommendations and never charged late fees if you had a good excuse. What they didn't know was that she'd spent nearly 5 decades running from something. On stage, a group of teenagers finished their dance routine to a pop song Margaret didn't recognize. The crowd clapped. The kids took their bows, all big smiles and high fives as they bounced off stage. The MC, a local radio DJ named Chuck who did this event every year, stepped up to the microphone. Wasn't that great, folks? Let's hear it one more time for the Henderson High Dance Team. More applause. Chuck looked down at his clipboard. All right, next up we have... Oh, this is interesting. We have Margaret Chen who's going to play piano for us. Margaret's stomach dropped straight through the floor. Her granddaughter, 17-year-old Lily, had signed her up without asking. When Margaret found out 2 weeks ago, she'd been furious, then terrified, then she'd almost called to cancel a dozen times. But Lily had looked at her with those hopeful eyes and said, "Grandma, you play so beautifully at home. Why does no one else get to hear it? Why? Because the last time Margaret played piano in front of people, someone had crushed her so completely that she'd spent the next 48 years hiding." "Margaret Chen?" Chuck said again, scanning the crowd. "Is Margaret here?" People started looking around. Margaret felt every eye in the room searching. Her heart hammered so hard she thought it might crack a rib. She couldn't move. Her legs had turned to concrete. Then she felt a warm hand slip into hers. Lily leaned close and whispered, "You don't have to do this. We can leave right now if you want. But Grandma, I've heard you play when you think no one's listening. You're amazing, and I think you want this. I think you've wanted this for a really long time." Margaret looked at her granddaughter. Lily had her mother's dark eyes and her father's stubborn chin. She also had something Margaret had lost decades ago, courage. "She's here," Lily called out, standing up. "She's coming." Before Margaret could protest, Lily was pulling her up from her seat and guiding her down the aisle. It was the longest walk of Margaret's life. Every step felt like walking through mud. She was aware of every person watching, every whisper, every phone that turned to point at her. The stage lights were even worse up close. They were hot and bright and made it impossible to see the audience clearly. Maybe that was a blessing. Margaret's hands were still shaking as she stood next to Chuck at the microphone. Chuck smiled at her, that professional radio guy smile. "Well, hello there, Margaret. We're excited to hear you play. What will you be performing for us tonight?" Margaret's mouth went dry. Her voice came out barely above a whisper. Just a simple tune. A simple tune," Chuck repeated into the microphone. "I love it. Sometimes simple is exactly what we need, right, folks?" He led a small round of encouraging applause. "Well, the piano is all yours. Whenever you're ready." He stepped aside, leaving Margaret alone under those terrible lights. The piano sat there waiting, a dark upright that had probably been in this community center since the 1980s. She walked over to it slowly and sat down on the bench. The keys stared up at her. Black and white, patient, waiting. Margaret's mind flashed back to another piano, another stage. She'd been 19 years old, a music student at the conservatory. Her whole life had been piano back then. She'd practiced 8 hours a day. She'd dreamed of concert halls and orchestras. She'd believed, truly believed, that music was her purpose. And then Professor Hartwell happened. She could still hear his voice, sharp and cold, cutting through her performance at the mid-year recital. "Stop, just stop." The piano had gone silent. The audience had gone silent. And he'd said, loud enough for everyone to hear, "This is pedestrian at best. You have no feeling, no soul in your playing. It's technically adequate but spiritually dead. If this is the best you can do, perhaps you should reconsider whether you belong here." Margaret had finished that semester. Barely. Then she'd left the conservatory and never went back. She'd buried her piano dreams so deep she'd convinced herself they'd died. But they hadn't died. They'd just been waiting. For 48 years, Margaret had played piano every single day in the privacy of her home. When her children were babies, she'd played soft lullabies while they slept. When her husband got sick, she'd played to quiet her fears. After he died 5 years ago, she'd played through her grief. The piano had been her constant companion, her therapist, her best friend. She'd just never let anyone else hear it. Now, sitting on this bench in this community center with 200 people waiting, Margaret realized something. Professor Hartwell's voice had been living in her head for 48 years, telling her she wasn't good enough. But Lily's voice was there too now, younger and stronger, saying, "You're amazing." Which voice would she believe? Margaret took a deep breath. She placed her hands on the keys. They were cool under her fingertips, familiar. The room had gone quiet. Someone coughed. A child whispered something and was quickly shushed. Margaret's hands were still shaking. But they knew what to do. They'd done this 10,000 times before, just never with anyone watching. She pressed down on the first key. The note rang out, clear and pure, filling the silence. Then another note. And another. Margaret had started to play. The first few notes came out shaky. Margaret could hear it. She knew everyone else could hear it too. Her fingers felt stiff, like they belonged to someone else. This wasn't how it sounded at home, alone in her living room with just the cat for company. She'd chosen a simple arrangement of a classical piece, something most people would recognize. Safe. Easy. Nothing that would draw too much attention. Just get through it and sit down, that was the plan. But as her hands moved across the keys, something strange happened. The shaking didn't stop, but the music started to find its way. Muscle memory kicked in. Her shoulders relaxed just a fraction. The notes began to flow together instead of feeling like separate, disconnected sounds. And that's when the memories came flooding back. She was 19 again, sitting in practice room 7 at the conservatory. It was a tiny room with cinder block walls painted a depressing beige and a single window that looked out at a brick wall, but it had a beautiful grand piano, and for Margaret back then that made it perfect. She'd spent more time in that practice room than in her dorm. Sometimes she'd practice so long she'd forget to eat. Her roommate used to slide granola bars under the door because she knew Margaret wouldn't stop for lunch. Music was everything. It was air and water and purpose all rolled into one. Young Margaret had believed she was building towards something. Every scale, every exercise, every piece she mastered was a brick in the foundation of her future. She'd see herself on stage at Carnegie Hall. She'd imagine her parents in the audience, proud and teary-eyed. She'd picture the reviews. A new virtuoso emerges. The mid-year recital was supposed to be her big moment. She'd been assigned Rachmaninoff's Piano Concerto No. 2, one of the most challenging and beautiful pieces ever written. She'd practiced it until her fingers ached. She'd memorized every note, every dynamic marking, every subtle shift in emotion. Back in the community center, Margaret's fingers pressed a wrong key. A sour note rang out. She winced. Kept going. The audience probably didn't even notice, but she noticed. She always noticed. That recital in 1976 had started so well. She'd walked onto the stage in the conservatory's concert hall, wearing a long black dress her mother had bought her special. Her hands hadn't been shaking then. She'd been nervous, sure, but it was the good kind of nervous. The kind that makes you sharp and focused. She'd played the opening measures perfectly. The piano sang under her hands. She could feel the music moving through her, exactly like it was supposed to. For those first few minutes, she was flying. Then Professor Hartwell stopped her. He was sitting in the third row with the other faculty members, holding his red pen and his scoring sheet. He'd stood up suddenly, right in the middle of her performance, and said in that cold voice, "Stop, just stop." Margaret had frozen, hands hovering over the keys. The concert hall went dead silent. Every student, every teacher, every parent visitor, all of them staring. "This is pedestrian at best," he'd said, not even bothering to walk closer to the stage. Just announced it from his seat like he was commenting on the weather. "You have no feeling, no soul in your playing. It's technically adequate but spiritually dead. If this is the best you can do, perhaps you should reconsider whether you belong here. The walk off that stage had been the longest of her life, until tonight. Now she understood that some walks are long because they're taking you toward something terrible. And some are long because they're taking you toward something terrifying but necessary. In the community center, Margaret's simple tune continued. She was about halfway through now. The notes were coming more easily. The shaking in her hands had calmed down a bit. She could feel the audience settling in, probably relieved that the nervous old lady wasn't completely falling apart up there. But inside her head, she was still back in 1976, sitting in the practice room the day after that recital. She'd cried so hard she'd made herself sick. Then she'd packed up her things. She'd called her parents and told them she was leaving the conservatory. They'd been confused, worried. They'd asked what happened. She couldn't tell them. How do you explain that someone took your dream and crushed it in front of 100 people? How do you put into words the feeling of being told that the one thing you love most, the thing you've given everything to, isn't good enough, that you aren't good enough? So she'd just said she wanted to do something else with her life. She'd enrolled in a regular university, got a degree in library science, met a kind man named Robert who worked at the campus bookstore. They'd gotten married, had 2 kids, built a normal, quiet life, and every single day she'd played the piano. But only when no one was home, only when the doors were locked and the curtains were drawn. She'd played all the pieces she'd learned at the conservatory. She'd taught herself new ones. She'd poured everything into that playing, all her joy, all her sadness, all the what-ifs and might-have-beens. When her daughter Sophie was born, Margaret played soft, gentle pieces full of wonder and hope. When her son David graduated college, she played something triumphant and bright. When Robert got his cancer diagnosis, she played dark, angry music that matched the fury in her heart. And when he died, she played everything, grief and love and gratitude and loss all mixed together until she couldn't tell one from the other. The piano had been her diary, her therapy, her secret life. For 48 years, those keys had held every feeling she couldn't speak out loud, but she'd never let anyone hear, never let anyone judge whether it was good enough, because Professor Hartwell's words had carved themselves into her bones, spiritually dead. Now, on this stage, playing this simple tune for these 200 people who probably just wanted to hear something nice before the next act, Margaret felt something shift inside her chest. It was small at first, like a door opening just a crack, a tiny bit of light getting in. Her hands moved through the familiar patterns. The melody rose and fell, and Margaret realized something she'd never let herself think before. Professor Hartwell had been wrong. Music that came from 48 years of living, from births and deaths and quiet Tuesday mornings and devastating losses and unexpected joys, couldn't be spiritually dead. It couldn't be, because it came from a spirit that had lived and survived and kept going, even when it wanted to quit. The simple tune was nearing its end now. Margaret could feel it approaching, that final resolution, and as her fingers moved toward those last few measures, something wild and reckless stirred inside her. The simple tune had served its purpose. It had gotten her on stage. It had gotten her hands on the keys. It had proven she could do this much. But what if she did more? Her heart started pounding again, but this time it wasn't fear. It was something else. Something she hadn't felt since she was 19 years old. Standing in practice room 7, believing anything was possible. The simple tune was supposed to end. Her fingers were supposed to play those final 3 chords and stop. Everyone would clap politely. She would stand up, take a small bow, and sit back down. Safe. Done. A nice moment, but nothing special. Instead, Margaret's hands kept moving. Instead of ending the simple tune, Margaret's fingers shifted. They moved to a different part of the keyboard, finding notes that didn't belong to the piece she'd been playing. The transition was so smooth that for a second even she wasn't sure she was doing it on purpose. But she was. Oh, she absolutely was. The new melody that began to flow from the piano was different, deeper, more complex. The kind of music that makes you sit up straighter in your chair without realizing you're doing it. Someone in the audience gasped quietly. Margaret heard it even through her concentration. She imagined Chuck, the MC, probably standing in the wings with a confused look on his face, wondering if this was still the simple tune she'd promised. Wasn't. Margaret's hands were playing the opening of Rachmaninoff's Piano Concerto No. 2, the piece she'd been humiliated trying to perform 48 years ago. the piece she'd practiced every single day since then, alone in her living room, never imagining anyone would hear it. Her fingers knew every note. They'd traveled this path thousands of times, but always in secret, always in safety. Never like this. Never in front of people who could judge, who could reject, who could tell her it wasn't good enough. The community center's old upright piano wasn't a concert grand. It didn't have the same rich, full sound. Some of the keys stuck a little. The tuning was probably off in places. But none of that mattered. Because Margaret wasn't playing the piano anymore. She was playing her life. The piece began soft and melancholy, the way Rachmaninoff wrote it. Those opening chords always sounded like a question to Margaret. Or maybe a memory, something beautiful that hurt a little to remember. Her hands were still shaking, but now they were shaking with adrenaline instead of fear. There's a difference. Fear makes you want to run away. Adrenaline makes you feel alive. The audience had gone completely still. The fidgeting stopped. The whispered conversations died. Even the children seemed to sense that something unexpected was happening. Phones that had been lowered rose back up. People started recording. Margaret's back straightened. Her shoulders rolled back. Sitting at that piano, she didn't feel 67 anymore. She felt 19, but a different kind of 19. The version of herself that should have existed if Professor Hartwell hadn't crushed her. Confident, capable, free. The music grew more intense. This was the section where the piece started to show its true colors, moving from melancholy to something more passionate. The piano concerto was written to be played with a full orchestra, but Margaret had spent decades learning to make the piano suggest those other instruments. The swooping strings, the bold brass, the gentle woodwinds. Her left hand danced in the bass, creating a foundation. Her right hand sang the melody, pulling emotion from every phrase. And somewhere in the middle of it all was Margaret, more present than she'd been in years. She thought about Robert, her husband. He'd known she played piano, of course. He'd heard her practicing. But she'd never told him about the conservatory or Professor Hartwell or the dream she'd abandoned. It felt too raw, even after decades of marriage. Too much like admitting she'd let someone else decide her worth. Robert had died 5 years ago, and Margaret had played at his funeral. But not like this. She'd played something gentle and safe while other people sang. She hadn't wanted to draw attention, hadn't wanted anyone to really hear her. Why? Why had she spent so much of her life making herself small? The music answered that question. Because making yourself small feels safer. Because if no one really sees you, no one can hurt you. Because hiding is easier than risking another rejection. But easier doesn't mean better. Margaret's fingers flew across the keys now, moving through a technically difficult passage that would challenge pianists half her age. Her arthritis was probably going to make her pay for this tomorrow. Her hands would ache. She'd need to ice them. She didn't care. The piece moved into a section that had always reminded her of arguing. The music having a conversation with itself. Different themes interrupting and overlapping. When she played this at home, she sometimes imagined it was her arguing with Professor Hartwell. Her music saying, "You were wrong about me. You were wrong." But tonight, under these hot stage lights with 200 people watching, Margaret realized she wasn't playing for Professor Hartwell anymore. She wasn't trying to prove him wrong. She wasn't even playing to prove herself right. She was just playing, for the pure joy and terror and aliveness of it. The audience didn't know what to do. This wasn't what they'd come to see. They'd expected cute kids doing dances and local teenagers singing pop songs and maybe a few adults doing comedy skits. They hadn't expected a 67-year-old librarian to suddenly unleash this kind of music. In the back row, Lily was crying. She'd pulled out her phone and was recording, her hands shaking almost as much as her grandmother's had at the beginning. She'd heard her grandmother play at home, sure. Beautiful music drifting from the living room while Lily did homework or scrolled through her phone. But this was different. This was her grandmother claiming something. Taking up space. Refusing to hide. The music built and built. This was the part of the concerto where, in a full performance, the orchestra would swell behind the piano, where the sound would fill a concert hall and make your chest vibrate with the power of it. Margaret played both parts, the piano and the echo of the orchestra, layering melodies on top of each other, her hands moving so fast they blurred. Sweat was starting to bead on her forehead. The stage lights were hot. Her arms were getting tired. She wasn't 19 anymore, no matter how she felt right now. Her body was 67 with all the aches and limitations that came with it, but her spirit was ageless. And her fingers remembered everything. She played through the pain, through the doubt that kept trying to creep in at the edges, through the voice of Professor Hartwell that still lived somewhere in the back of her mind, trying to tell her to stop. Through 48 years of silence and safety and small hidden moments, the piece was approaching one of its most famous sections, a soaring melody that always made Margaret's heart clench. She'd played it at home when Sophie got married, when David's daughter Lily was born, when Robert took his last breath in the hospital room while Margaret held his hand. She'd played it for every important moment of her life. But always alone, always in secret, not anymore. Margaret's hands lifted for just a fraction of a second, hanging in the air. Then they came down on the keys with a force and clarity she'd forgotten she possessed. The melody rang out, pure and strong and absolutely undeniably alive. And something inside Margaret Chen, something that had been locked away since 1976, finally broke free. The music poured out of Margaret like water from a broken dam. There was no stopping it now. Every note she'd held inside for 48 years was demanding to be heard. Her fingers moved through the most technically demanding section of the concerto. In the original version, this was where the orchestra would drop away and let the piano take center stage. A solo moment. The pianist against the world. Margaret had practiced this section 10,000 times. Maybe more. She knew it so well that her hands could play it while her mind wandered. But right now, her mind wasn't wandering anywhere. She was completely, totally present. Tears were streaming down her face. She didn't bother wiping them away. Her hands couldn't stop, wouldn't stop. The salt stung her eyes a little, but she barely noticed. She was too busy playing every emotion she'd ever felt. The anger came first. Anger at Professor Hartwell for crushing a 19-year-old's dreams. Anger at herself for believing him. Anger at all the years she'd wasted hiding, playing only for her cat and her empty living room. The music turned sharp and fierce, her fingers attacking the keys with a force that made some people in the audience flinch. Then came the grief. Robert's death, the way cancer had slowly stolen him from her. The hospital rooms, the treatments that didn't work. The morning she woke up and he was on the other side of the bed, still and quiet and gone. She played that grief into the piano, every chord heavy with loss. But grief wasn't the end. It never was. The music shifted again, finding something softer. Memories of joy started weaving through the melancholy. Sophie's first steps, David's high school graduation, the way Robert used to dance with her in the kitchen when a song he liked came on the radio. Lily being born, small and red and screaming, but perfect. Margaret realized something as her hands flew across the keys. This piece, this incredibly difficult piece that she'd practiced in secret for almost 5 decades, wasn't just music anymore. It was her autobiography. Every measure told a story. Every dynamic shift was a chapter of her life. The audience wasn't moving. Somewhere in the third row, a woman had her hand over her mouth. A teenage boy who'd been slouched in his seat was sitting up straight, his eyes wide. An older man was gripping his wife's hand so tightly his knuckles had turned white. They could feel it. Even if they didn't know Rachmaninoff from Mozart, even if they couldn't name a single note Margaret was playing, they could feel the truth in it. Music doesn't lie. Not when it's played like this. Not when it comes from someplace this deep. Margaret's arms were burning now. Her shoulders ached. Her fingers were starting to cramp. She was pushing her 67-year-old body to do things it hadn't done in public for almost 50 years. Everything hurt. She didn't slow down. The piece was approaching its climax, the section where the piano and orchestra were supposed to build together towards something massive and overwhelming. Margaret played it all, her left hand thundering in the bass while her right hand soared above. The old upright piano shook with the force of it. A few keys stuck and she had to hit them twice. The sound wasn't perfect, but it was real, and real was better than perfect. She thought about that day in 1976 standing on the conservatory stage while Professor Hartwell told her she had no soul. She thought about walking off that stage humiliated and broken. She thought about packing her bags and leaving that life behind. And she thought about every single day since then, sitting at her piano at home, playing to an audience of no one. All those hours, all those years, all that music that no one heard. What a waste, part of her whispered. You could have been playing for people this whole time. But another part of her, the part that was currently playing Rachmaninoff in a community center at 67 years old, thought, maybe I wasn't ready until now. Maybe I needed those 48 years. Maybe I needed to live a whole life before I could play with this much truth. The music was reaching its peak. This was the section that always made Margaret's heart race when she played it at home. The part where everything came together, all the themes, all the emotions, all the technical skill into one massive, overwhelming moment. Her hands were flying now. Left hand, right hand, both working together in perfect coordination, despite the arthritis and the shaking and the fact that she hadn't performed for another human being since 1976. It was like her body remembered something her mind had tried to forget. That she was good at this. That she'd always been good at this. The tears were still falling, but Margaret was smiling now too. Actually smiling, while playing some of the most difficult music ever written for piano. Because it hit her all at once, she was doing it. She was actually doing it. She was playing the piece Professor Hartwell had stopped her from finishing, and no one was stopping her now. The audience was mesmerized. Phones were being held high, recording every second. Someone's flash went off and then off again. A few people were openly crying. Others looked like they'd forgotten how to breathe. In the back row, Lily was texting furiously between recording, sending videos to her mom with messages like, "Mom, are you seeing this?" and "I told you Grandma was amazing." Her fingers could barely type because her hands were shaking with emotion. Chuck, the MC, was standing in the wings with his mouth hanging open. In 15 years of hosting this talent show, he'd seen kids sing off-key, adults tell bad jokes, and one memorable year when someone's pet parrot flew into the audience and chaos erupted. But he'd never seen anything like this. Never seen someone transform right there on stage. Never felt music hit him in the chest like a physical force. Margaret's fingers were on fire. Her whole body was screaming at her to stop, to rest, to be reasonable about what a 67-year-old woman should be doing on a community center stage on a Thursday night. She ignored every signal. She was so close to the end now, so close to finishing what she'd started 48 years ago. The final section was approaching, the part where the piano makes one last statement before the piece resolves. Margaret took a breath, her hands hovering for just a split second over the keys. In that tiny pause, the whole room seemed to hold its breath with her. Then she came down on the keys with everything she had left. The sound that came out of that old upright piano was bigger than it had any right to be. Bigger than the instrument. Bigger than the room. Bigger than one small woman who'd spent half a century hiding her gift. The music built one final time, climbing and climbing until it reached a place where words couldn't follow. A place where only sound existed, where only feeling mattered. And then, with 3 final thunderous chords that seemed to shake the walls, Margaret played the last notes of Rachmaninoff's Piano Concerto No. 2. The last chord rang out into the silence. Margaret's hands stayed on the keys, feeling the vibration travel through her fingers, up her arms, into her chest. The note held in the air, echoing off the walls of the community center, taking its time to fade away. Then nothing. Complete silence. Margaret sat frozen at the piano bench, her hands still touching the keys. Her heart was pounding so hard she could hear it in her ears. Sweat dripped down her back. Her fingers were cramping. Her shoulders burned. She'd just played the most physically and emotionally demanding 12 minutes of her entire life, and no one was making a sound. The silence stretched. 1 second. 2 seconds, 3. Margaret's stomach dropped. This was it. This was the moment she'd feared for 48 years. She'd finally played for people again, really played, given them everything she had, and they were sitting there in silence because it wasn't good enough, because Professor Hartwell had been right all along. 4 seconds, 5 seconds, she couldn't look up, couldn't face the audience. She just stared down at her hands on the keys, waiting for someone to cough politely or for Chuck to jump in with some cheerful comment to move things along. Waiting for the rejection to come, 6 seconds, then she heard it. A single sound from the back of the room. The scrape of a chair. Lily had stood up. Tears were streaming down her 17-year-old face, mascara running, not caring at all. She brought her hands together, once, twice. The claps echoed in the silent room. Then someone else stood. An older woman in the middle section. then a man near the front, then 3 more people, then 10, then everyone. The entire audience rose to their feet like a wave, and the applause crashed over Margaret like thunder. It wasn't polite clapping. It wasn't the kind of applause you give because you're supposed to. This was loud and wild and real. People were shouting, cheering. Some were crying as hard as Lily. A man in the front row was whistling with his fingers. The teenage boy who'd been slouched in his seat was clapping so hard his hands had to hurt. The sound washed over Margaret, and she finally looked up. 200 people on their feet for her, for the music she'd been hiding for almost 50 years. She couldn't move, couldn't stand, couldn't even process what was happening. Her brain had stopped working. All she could do was sit there on that piano bench while her whole body shook and tears poured down her face. The applause kept going. 1 minute, 2 minutes, 3. People weren't getting tired. If anything, they were getting louder. Someone started chanting more, and others joined in. Chuck ran onto the stage, his radio host composure completely gone. His eyes were red. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said into his microphone, but his voice cracked. He had to stop and clear his throat. "Ladies and gentlemen, Margaret Chen." The applause somehow got even louder. Lily pushed through the crowd and ran up onto the stage. She didn't care that she wasn't supposed to. She threw her arms around her grandmother and held on tight. "I told you," she whispered in Margaret's ear. "I told you that you were amazing." Margaret couldn't speak. She just held on to her granddaughter and cried. The standing ovation lasted 5 full minutes. When it finally started to die down and people began to sit, there was this energy in the room that hadn't been there before, like something important had just happened and everyone knew it. Margaret eventually stood up, still shaky, and took a bow. The applause surged again. Chuck had to wait another full minute before he could continue with the show. But nobody minded. Nobody was checking their phones or thinking about what came next. They were all still lost in what they'd just experienced. What Margaret didn't know, couldn't have known, was that at least 30 people had posted videos of her performance online within minutes. One video, shot by a woman in the 3rd row with a good phone and steady hands, captured the whole thing. The simple beginning. The transition to Rachmaninoff. The tears. The passion. All 12 minutes. By the next morning, that video had 15,000 views. By noon, 500,000. By the end of the week, it had crossed 40 million. The comments poured in from around the world. This made me cry at work. I haven't played piano since high school, but this makes me want to start again. Who is this woman, and why doesn't she have a recording contract? The way she plays, you can hear a whole lifetime in it. This is what courage looks like. 3 weeks after that Thursday night at the community center, Margaret got a phone call. A very unexpected phone call. It was from a concert hall coordinator in New York City. Someone had canceled their scheduled performance, and they'd seen the video. And would Margaret possibly be interested in playing at Carnegie Hall? Margaret thought it was a prank at first. Then she thought she was dreaming. Then she realized it was real, and she had to sit down because her legs stopped working. She said yes. Obviously, she said yes. 4 months later, Margaret Chen walked onto the stage at Carnegie Hall wearing a midnight blue dress and the same shaky hands she'd had at the community center. But this time, the shaking stopped the moment she sat down at the piano. This time, she knew what she was capable of. She played Rachmaninoff's Piano Concerto No. 2 with a full orchestra behind her. The same piece that had been stopped 48 years ago. The same piece she'd practiced in secret for decades. The same piece that had finally set her free. The Carnegie Hall audience gave her a standing ovation that lasted 7 minutes. But that wasn't the best part. The best part came later. Margaret started teaching piano to adults who, like her, had given up on their dreams. She taught in her living room at first, then had to rent space in the community center because too many people wanted lessons. Her students were people in their 40s, 50s, 60s, 70s. People who'd been told they weren't good enough. People who'd hidden their gifts. People who thought it was too late. She told every single one of them the same thing on their first lesson. It's never too late. And you get to decide if you're good enough. No one else. Just you. One of her students was a 53-year-old accountant who hadn't touched a guitar since college. Another was a 47-year-old nurse who'd always wanted to sing. A 61-year-old man who'd written poetry in notebooks for decades but never shown anyone. A 72-year-old woman who painted in her garage at night. Margaret helped them all find their courage. Not because she was some special person, But because she'd learned something on that community center stage that night, she'd learned that the only person who'd been stopping her all these years was herself. Professor Hartwell had been dead for 10 years. She found his obituary one day while searching online. He'd died in 2015, probably never knowing that his cruel words had shaped the next 5 decades of her life. Margaret printed out that obituary, but not to be bitter, not to hold on to anger. She put it in her piano bench as a reminder that other people's opinions are just that, opinions. They don't have to become your truth. Every time she sat down to play now, whether at home or on stage or teaching a nervous student, she remembered that night. The night she stopped hiding. The night she decided that living small wasn't safer. It was just smaller. And Margaret Chen was done being small. She was 67 years old when she finally started living the life she was meant to live. And she had never felt more alive.